Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Stanley, and welcome this evening to the latest in a series of webinars that Rowley Turton are putting on for our clients, and perhaps also some people who would like to become clients. The subject tonight is an important one. It affects most of us. It's about what happens when we need care in our later years, whether that's for ourselves or perhaps for our parents. Telling us about that subject tonight is my colleague Scott Gallagher, who's here. He's a chartered financial planner like myself, but in Scott's case, he's also a qualified expert in this particular field. So we can shoot all our questions on this subject at him. So before I pass you over to him, there's a few things just to be aware of. Keep going. So your microphones are muted today, so there's no problem from your end. And there's also a Q&A feature through Zoom at the bottom of the screen. You can click and ask questions, and we'll be taking all of those at the end. So there'll be plenty of time to ask questions. At the end of this, in case you miss anything, we'll send a recording to everyone who attends. And if you experience any technical difficulties, just let us know. At the end of this webinar, we'll make the offer to you if everyone would like a free book. It's called Enough. And that's something which describes a little bit, not about long-term care specifically, but about the way Rowley Turton works with its clients. So remember that at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Scott, and he will take you on a journey through the topic of care in old age. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. As Martin said, my name is Scott Gallagher. I'm a chartered financial planner and long-term care specialist with Rowley Turton IFA Limited. We are a long-established firm of independent financial advisors based in Leicester, just at the end of the M69. Care fees, a growing concern for many people, or in fact most people, arguably the elephant in the room. We've got an ageing population, a demographic time bomb, predictions of 1.7 million people needing long-term care, or extra long people needing long-term care in the next 20 years. Chronic underfunding of anyone who's had experience of the care sector generally. Care staff shortages. The BMA are predicting there being shortages or additional staff needed of 500,000 people by 2030. NHS in crisis. And various governments, no matter what the colour, kicking the can down the road. We've had various attempts to fix the care problem in the UK, from Gordon Brown's National Care Service to the Deal Not report that proposed a cap on care fees. Generally, when the government look at these, they realise it's an issue because we as individuals don't want to pay for a carer, or parents spending their houses, wealth and other savings and investments to pay for care. And we as taxpayers equally don't want to pay for care. So it is a problem for us all. And it's not a very easy to solve problem, especially in the current financial crisis. So current care costs. When we look at care, generally we're looking at one of three elements, possibly premium care homes, which I'll touch on briefly. So there's domiciliary care, which is care in your own home. And this is, I think, the point that most of us, if we were to need care, would hope to start at, that we would rather remain in our own home with somebody coming in to help us. But even that is not cheap. So care costs, and they're generally for an agency, so it's not necessarily what the carer receives, but those care costs are £23 to £34 an hour, depending where you are. Could be more, could be less. But to put that into context, if you need somebody to come in for just 2 hours a day and get you out of bed, maybe help feed you and perhaps put you to bed at night, or just some assistance, so just 2 hours a week, at those kind of prices, that's about £400 per week. Now, bear in mind the story about the winter fuel allowance and how people who earn about receive a state pension or pension income of around £220 per week do not get pension credits and therefore do not get the winter fuel allowance. Then you can imagine that if your state pension's only that £200 a week, and the care fees, even in your home, at £400, there's obviously quite a mismatch in that. Then the second level is residential homes, and people tend to use the phrase care home a bit loosely, and I'm as guilty as anybody else on that. And they tend to mix that up between residential homes, where primarily it's personal care without a nursing care element, and nursing homes, which are essentially the same thing, but where there's nursing care. And I'll touch on to what that difference is later. And then obviously you've got premium care homes. So if you're in Leicestershire, the likes of South Lodge, which is noticeably more expensive. Oh, I didn't mention the costs, so you'll see it on screen. But residential care homes, typically just over £1,000 a week, and I say that is a week, not a month, so £56,000 a year, give or take. Obviously it does vary. Nursing homes, fundamentally the same with a nursing element, so more expensive. So average costs of £1,300 per week, so nearly £70,000 a year. This is expensive. These figures have gone up dramatically from when I first started doing these types of talks, which was 10 or 15 years ago, and the cost just keeps going up and up. So the specific title of the talk was regarding the 7 myths of long-term care. I've been doing this talk 10 or 15 years, and they fundamentally haven't changed, but I'll run through them. 1, the state will pay for my care. Secondly, my family will support me. Or 3, I'll simply give my house away, so I don't have to worry about care fees. I've already given my house in trust, or I'm planning to, so that will save me from care fees. Don't worry about it. My inheritance will cover it. I'm going to inherit money, and that will cover my care fee costs, so I'm not too concerned. My favourite, I'll die before I run out of money. Seems to be a preferred option for a lot of people. Just push me off a cliff or something. I'm not sure it's the most practical, but also run through why that's probably not going to be the case. And finally, I can sort it out later. So people, not they don't want to look at this or don't want to sort it. It's just life gets in the way, and they think they will deal with it later, which I think is dangerous. So the first one is the myth that the state will pay for my care. I think I mentioned earlier about the NHS and the care service and various crises. I think people think that care is similar to the NHS, and they think that the NHS will pick up the bill, but generally they won't. There are exceptions, but the general point is they do not. And that is because long-term care is primarily made up of personal care, nursing care, and accommodation costs. And if you think about the NHS, it's primarily concerned about nursing and or medical care. So of course, if I break my leg and I end up in hospital, of course, the NHS cover all of those costs, nursing, personal care, and accommodation costs whilst I'm in hospital. But as soon as I come out of hospital, then they're not paying any of those costs. But also, if I'm in a care home, most of those costs are actually personal care and accommodation costs, not nursing care. And this was illustrated by the relatively small difference in price or cost of a residential care home and a nursing home. The difference was a couple £100 a week, and that's the issue that people have. And the NHS generally only covers nursing care, so that's the first problem we have. And then secondly, if you've got accessible assets of over £23,250, you're generally self-funding, and that's both in terms of capital but also income. So even if your assets are below £23,250, you can make a partial contribution, which in a lot of cases can be most of your income, and I'll touch on that later. And even if your assets are below £14,250, which is the lowest level, as it were, you still make a partial contribution, which is essentially most of your income. So even if your assets are only £14,250, it's not true that you do not pay for your care. It's just that you probably don't have much money in the first place, in a sense. But I'll come onto that in more detail later. But the idea is that for most people attending this webinar, your assets will be over that £23,250 figure, and you will be paying for your own care. It's only when your assets get below that figure, generally, that the local authority will start paying for your care. It is worth mentioning a small caveat to that. That asset figure includes your house, but if there is a spouse, if your spouse is still in the house and you're in a care home, the house is generally excluded. If you have a disabled relative living with you, or living in the house, you'll say, then the house is generally excluded. Or if you have a family member age 60 over, so say your 2 brothers sharing a house or something like that, generally exempted. But if you're in the house and your brother's 59, then it's generally not excluded. So houses are normally included in that 23,250, but there are exceptions. So I said, the reality is, if you've got capital more than 23,250, and that can and often includes the value of your house, then you will have to pay for your own care, and it is expensive, as I've mentioned earlier. You're in over £1,000 a week, not a month, for a normal residential care home, and for a nursing home, then £1,300 per week plus £70,000 a year. It is not cheap. Second myth, your family will support you. Everyone that's older remembers the old Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the original, with Gene Wilder, I think it was. And the idea of there was Mum, there was Charlie, and there was 4 grandparents all sharing the bed. That is, rightly or wrongly, not the current scenario in my experience. People are less likely to want their parents and or grandparents living with them. Families are increasingly fragmented, and location is an issue. People move around a lot more because of job mobility. People go away to university and then stay at university. Remote working means you can live and work anywhere, and that can be good in terms of allowing people to come home and care for family, as it were, but it also means people are more likely to be widespread, and we have international migration now that people live all around the world. I was golfing with somebody the other day, and his daughter was still relatively local. She lived a county or two away, so again, not close enough to tuck you in at night or to make sure you've had some food or to get you up in the morning. But his son had actually emigrated to Australia years before. So again, yes, it's very nice to have a Zoom call and go on holiday, but if you need care, they are not going to be able to provide any physical assistance practically. The other point is we're all living longer generally. So when we ourselves need care, we're likely to be older, but also our children are likely to be older. So they might be in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s when we need care. So the question is, are they young and healthy enough to be able to help us? Are they, have they got a physical strength to be able to get us, out of bed in the morning, or to put us to bed, or to bathe us? If it's a financial issue, are they wealthy enough to contribute? People have got their own financial concerns. They're trying to still pay off the mortgage, perhaps. They've got kids at university that they have to make financial contributions for and help out, try and desperately save for their own pension. So they might not be able to help pay to your care costs, even if they can't physically, help themselves. Also, can they afford the time? People are much more time pressured, I think, nowadays. And will the spouse resent them? So if you're saying, oh, so I'm going to pop around and I'll put you to bed, mum, I'll get you up in the morning, I'll commit that time and make you dinner. Well, what does their spouse feel about you, or what does your spouse feel about you doing that? So there can be resentment issues. So the reality is you might be on your own. It sounds incredibly harsh, and it perhaps is, but I think the reality is people will not have the family support that they expect to receive. And I've seen this recently. Somebody went into care home and the family got around together and decided what they might contribute. And one of the children was, yeah, that's fine, I'll make a contribution X. The other one, who was receiving the house, I would hasten to add, was quite happy to make a contribution. One of his other siblings, who wasn't receiving the house, I think took issue with that, didn't feel it was appropriate at all that she could contribute towards her parents' care, especially since the brother was receiving the house. So, and I think that's caused a bit of anguish in the family, but I don't think it's completely unexpected. I mentioned earlier, some people think they're fine because they simply give their house away. So, okay, I've got to pay for care, get that Scott, it's expensive, but I've given my house away, or I plan to, and therefore I won't have the house, so I don't have to pay for my care. Well, first thing to say is it's unlikely to work due to what are called deliberate deprivation rules. These are the specific rules that say if you deliberately deprive yourself of an asset, i.e. you've given it away in order to forward care fees or claim benefits, then the local authority, in the case of care, can refuse to pay for your care. And you might think it's their problem because, well, I don't have a house, Scott, so it's the local authority's problem. It's not the local authority's problem if they deem you to deliberately deprive yourself of that property. They just won't pay. And in certain circumstances, they can even sue the children to recover the value of the house, or actually the asset, and all of the money she received. It's worth pointing out there's no time limit or 7-year clock on gifting for deliberate deprivation purposes. So unlike inheritance tax planning, where if you made the gift 7 years ago, it would be exempt, this is not the case for deliberate deprivation. There are cases where people have given money away less than 7 years ago, and it's been deemed not to be deliberate deprivation for various reasons. And then there's cases where people have given money away more than 7 years ago, and it has been deemed to be deliberate deprivation. There was a case recently, which I read about, where the son and I think it was mum who was in the care home, they had a meeting with local authority, discussed their finances and what happened. And the son very confidently told the local authority that he was fine because his mum had gifted his house to him more than 7 years ago. At which point the local authority said, so you believe that there's a 7-year clock for long-term care planning? And he was, yes, I'm more than 7 years away, we're perfectly fine, you cannot do anything. And they took that as confirmation that it was specifically for long-term care fees planning that the house had been gifted. There was no inheritance tax reason to do it. And therefore, they essentially put that house back on the table for the care fees thing. So it backfired on him spectacular. Equally, there's no exempt gift amounts on like inheritance tax planning, and it's risky. Even if you do gift your house away, and some people do it and it does work, I'll caveat that, but it shouldn't in a sense. Can you trust your kids? Would they not try to evict you and sell the property and use that money for themselves or the house they own? What if they become bankrupt? Could creditors claim your house? What if your children get divorced? could your ex-son-in-law or daughter-in-law claim half your house? Possibly. So you have to be very careful. So I say, in reality, it's dangerous and might not work. And I would say I would expect it not to work. So, okay, I can't give my house away, Scott. I get that. Okay, that probably is not going to work. But okay, what about these or so-called asset protection trusts? Or heard about? Maybe I've done one. I was speaking to somebody the other day whose parents had been missold one. I think was how they felt. Again, unlikely to work due to deliberate deprivation rules. Again, risky. You've got divorce, bankruptcy, etc. of trustees and beneficiaries. Some of these are been arranged through specialist solicitors or will writers, and we've come across cases where those firms have subsequently essentially gone bust, and then it's very grey about who has control and ownership in that sense of the house, and that's caused huge angst for the people concerned, and and huge uncertainty. There's a loss of control of assets because if you've gifted your house to a trust, then it's technically not yours, and so who controls it? That's problematic. The trusts themselves tend to be expensive, a couple of £1,000 plus. I've certainly seen prices of £3,000 or £4,000 quoted. I would say, when I speak to solicitors in Leicestershire, the good, well-established firms that we would hopefully know and trust, I can't think of a single one of those firms that have advised their clients to take out these trusts. The somewhat more salesy firms I have seen selling these trusts. So I think that gives you an indication of where the legal profession is in this use of these trusts. And there's certainly an argument there is false promises and mis-selling of these trusts, and they can have adverse tax consequences. So again, like giving away your house, just be a trust this time, it's dangerous, can be expensive and might not even work. Finally, again, okay, care fee is expensive. I've got to pay. That's going to have a knock on me, or the money I leave to my children. But it's okay because I'm going to get money from my parents. So my inheritance, the money that I will receive from my parents, will cover it. Lots of issues with that. Again, with all financial planning, going on inheritances being received is dangerous. You've got longevity risk. Parents may live longer than you expect. So by the time you need care and therefore might need the money to help pay for it, you might not be getting it yet because your parents might still be here. You've got parents' own care position. So that any inheritance you get may be gone completely or certainly much less because of, that it's been spent on their care fee. Second families. Second marriages is not uncommon, even in old age. And therefore you can see your inheritance delayed, diluted, or even disappear, whether deliberately or accidentally. Your mum dies, dad marries somebody else much younger, he leaves your inheritance, or as you would see it, your inheritance to her to protect her. Possibly has additional children, so you've got now half brothers and sisters. Again, feels that they need more help than you do because they're, or just simply buys a house with his wife, doesn't do a will, and then it effectively just automatically passes to the stepmom, kind of accidentally in a sense. Families fall out. Sad, but I've come across plenty of cases where people fall out, and even where parents have disinherited children. So again, you can't be certain you're going to get it. And then obviously you've got inheritance tax. We've got a budget shortly. Might change inheritance tax. It's expensive anyway at 40% over the £1 million threshold. So you might not receive what you expect just because of tax. So again, you might not receive what you expected or when you need it. So again, relying on it for care fees, I think is dangerous. Again, one of my favourites, I will die before I run out of money. Scott, don't worry about it. Well, firstly, you've got this longevity risk. The average stay in a care home is around 2.5 years, but you may live longer than expected. 10% stay less than 1 year, but 10% stay more than 8 years. So if we're talking about a cost of maybe 50, 60, 70,000 pounds, and you're going to be in there for 10 years, that could be a £500,000 cost. Which, if you've got a half decent house in Leicester and a bit of savings, that could all be gone. In that case, simply 10% chance that it could all potentially be gone. Care is expensive, and also care costs typically rise faster than inflation. As I said, I've been doing this talk for a long time, and during that time, costs just keep going up and up and up. So I said, the reality is you might not do it as soon as you hope or expect. Again, finally, okay, well, it's all right. I can sort it out later, Scott. I don't need to worry about it today. Unfortunately not. If you leave things last minute, as we're all tempted to do, what is the impact? Well, firstly, reduce care options. If perhaps you've been caring for mum and helping her, and then finally either her care needs worsen, she needs more care, or you're at the end of your tether. I've certainly had clients in my office in tears because of the pressure of providing care for mum and dad has put on them, and you need to get them into a care home sooner just for your own sanity, if nothing else. Well, of course, anything you're doing in haste, you've generally got less choice. You're rushing around, you haven't necessarily done the research, maybe you don't get the best or the most cost-effective option, so that's not good. And also asset protection. I mentioned the deliberate deprivation rules and how giving away houses and money and use of trust, might not work. If you do things earlier, bizarrely, they can work. So again, but if you leave it to last minute, then it's unlikely. Literally, mum's going to the care home tomorrow and you're trying to sign a deed to the house over, it's almost certainly not going to work. Missed benefits. There are various benefits that you can claim if you need help and assistance, especially as you're older. They aren't always backdated if you've missed the claim, and therefore look at those things earlier is sensible. Can you claim attendance allowance for yourself, or can your mother or father claim it? If you're caring for them, can you claim carers allowance yourself? And all of these factors. Legal challenges. If you act early enough and you've got capacity, you can do your wills, you can do lasting powers of attorney. It gives the rights to spouses or children to make financial decisions to you. If you lose capacity, you can't do wills or lasting powers of attorney. And various other financial planning and legal matters you can no longer take on. And I mentioned earlier about the emotional burden on family. If these things are planned, it lessens the burden a little bit. You're not running around at the last minute. Even as simple as choosing a care home for dad. If dad's still got capacity, he can be involved in that process. You can decide whether he wants to be near you or your brother, whether what preferences he has. Maybe he's looked at himself. If he loses capacity, then you can't have that conversation with him necessarily. You might not know whether he wanted to be nearer you or his brother. You might not know whether he wanted this care home or that care home. And again, that can cause guilt, for want of a better word, and you don't know what dad might have wanted. And so therefore, whereas talking about this sooner would obviously be beneficial for all. So again, the reality is delaying planning for longer term care can lead to fewer choices, higher costs, and emotional stress for you and your loved ones. But planning early is obviously key. So just to recap, 7 key points. Normally, you're paying for your own care, and certainly our clients. Your family might not be there to care for you. Giving your house away is dangerous and might not work. So-called asset protection trusts are expensive, dangerous, and again, might not work. Relying on potential inheritances to pay for your own care is dangerous. You might live longer than you think, and delaying is dangerous. So having gone through the 7 myths and reality and recapped on it, I think it's worth just stopping briefly to look at some practical advice for long-term care planning, things that may or may not help you and your family situation. So we can look at maximising savings and investments, preparing legally, and claiming benefits. So maximise savings and investments. It's a simple thing that care is expensive, so the more money you have, the better off you are, in the sense. I think people look at it the wrong way around. People look at it, try and get their wealth down so that they don't pay for care, but then that puts you in the prospect of the local authority deciding your care home and care package, which is not really what you want to be. They generally have an involvement anyway, even if you're self-funding, but you want control of the care you have and the care home you receive and where that, the care home you go into and where that care is, care home is located. So if you take early action with regards to investments, I mean, you can get saving and investing sooner, and hopefully you build up a bigger pot, all things being equal, and therefore you've got money to pay for your care. Maximise interest rates and investment returns. I was chatting to somebody the other day. They had £100,000 that was on deposit, and it's a classic thing. It was a decent rate when they took out the account, and of course now the bank have changed the terms and conditions and they're offering a new account. But the account that they're on, it went from paying 4 or 5% interest to paying less than 1%. So if they've got £100,000 on deposit, that's £4,000 less in interest they are receiving than if they were on the best account, as it were. Now, if that's left to languish for 10 years, which isn't unusual, that can be a £40,000 difference. That, along with your state pension and other income, could make the difference between 1 extra year in the care home of choice as opposed to the local authority's care home of choice. That's worth it for basically just moving around your bank account. That's sensible. Same with investment returns. Obviously, you've got to ensure appropriateness. You've got to check the charges, make sure you're not overpaying, make sure any investments or savings are appropriate for risk. Access. Again, we've come across this in the past. People tie their money up certainly in bank accounts to get the best rate, but don't always think about their financial position or personal position. So if you are likely to go in a care home in the next 6 months, putting the bulk of your savings in a 1-year account, which might have a 6-month interest penalty or no access at all, it might leave you in a difficult position, because what happens in 6 months' time, you go into care home, you can't actually access the money or can't access it without a huge penalty. Tax. Again, you can do planning with tax, and we do a lot of tax planning for clients. And again, the sooner you look at it, the better. Tax efficiency, make use of ISAs. Again, if you're not paying, if you're reducing your tax liability, that is more money for you. So basically, that means you have a bigger pot, and therefore you can pay for a nicer, better care home for longer. Premium bonds, again, very popular with clients. Know people that won 100,000 or £1 million, goes a long way to lessening your care fees issue. If you just want £1 million, it gives you other problems, inheritance tax and stuff, but you can't have everything. In simple terms, more money means longer, better care, all things being equal. Prepare legally. I mentioned earlier, if you've got capacity, we can look at wills and lasting power of attorney, advanced decisions, living wills, specific instructions about your medical care. If you've lost capacity and you haven't done that, that's all gone. Trusts. Now, I mentioned the so-called asset protection trusts, and I was not a fan of that at all, or a fan of those at all. But there are lots of trusts that we use for clients on a, probably a daily basis, really, that can help preserve money for families, can help for tax planning, can help protect against long-term care fees. One of my favourites, which I'll only touch on briefly, but if anyone wants a separate conversation later, I'm quite happy to have a meeting, even myself or Martin can assist, is regarding husband and wife, house is owned jointly, the traditional way is joint tenancy. Husband dies, the house passes to the wife goes into the care home, all of that house then is potentially used to pay for care fees. However, the husband and wife could have split the house via a severance of tenancy into an ownership called tenants in common. So they own 50% each rather than the house together, as it were. They can both write new wills where they leave their 50% share to a trust rather than to each other. That trust would normally ensure that the survivor can live in the house rent-free for the rest of their life. But the capital value of their half of the house passes to children and grandchildren, not to the spouse. This can be incredibly valuable for clients in terms of protecting at least half of the house from care fees. And yet, on a weekly basis, I come across cases where people haven't done this. People are amazed that you can do it. It's not particularly controversial, not particularly expensive. Generally needs a solicitor or specialist kind of accountant, something like Rowley's, to look at if it's done. Inheritances you might receive from parents. So you might want to, if we're all getting older and you're going to have your own care fees issue and any inheritance you receive might simply go paying care fees, you might speak to your parents about them rewriting their will to leave your money, as it were, to a trust to effectively bypass you for care fees purposes. Perfectly legal and legitimate. Again, if we're older and thinking that our children are also older and we might be worried about their situation, we might use the same principle for us. We might leave our children's inheritance to them indirectly via some kind of trust arrangement to protect them from care fees. And again, to each other, to our spouses. I mentioned before, split the house in half is an option, leaving your half not directly to spouse, but indirectly via a trust arrangement to protect it. There's lots you can do. That is very hard to do once you've lost capacity, or at the last minute, or if somebody's already died. Well, some ways you can do some things, but you're better to kind of start sooner. Finally, claim benefits. Cost of care is expensive. Benefits do not solve the problem entirely, but they help. So you've got attendance allowance. I'll just check the figures. 1 second, I wrote it down early. So apologies for stepping away. But yeah, attendance allowance, £72.65 a week or £108.55. Generally, if you're in a nursing home, you're going to get attendance allowance anyway, but it could be overlooked. And again, that could be £5,000 a year, which again helps towards a bit. It doesn't solve the problem, but every little helps. NHS funded nursing care. Again, I mentioned this point earlier about the difference between personal care and accommodation costs and nursing care. If you've got a medical need, then in addition to the attendance allowance, you can also potentially claim NHS funded nursing care. And that is an amount between £235 and change per week and £324 per week, which then will go towards bridging that cost difference between residential care and nursing care home. And therefore, again, it helps the cost. In an ideal world, the NHS would pick up the tab. But as I explained, it's generally not the situation because it's generally primarily personal care. However, for some people, it is primarily medical care. And this is covered by the NHS under a principle called NHS Continuing Healthcare. fully funded package where they pay all of the costs. And we've certainly come across cases where people, the NHS have effectively picked up a tab of £100,000 a year. So all the care home costs for people. And this is not something you want to overlook. You don't want to find that, somebody died and they were in a care home for 5 years paying, £100,000 a year, and you could have had the NHS pay for it and you didn't. I think they've also limited how much you can backdate those claims as well. So you definitely need to be proactive on that. It is very hard to get, so it is definitely exceptional. There is a system where you can download a checklist for the continuing healthcare. However, the system is somewhat flawed because you'll go through the answers to the checklist and that will say that you qualify for an assessment in almost all cases, in my experience. However, that assessment is done when you fail. The bar is set very, very high, but it is definitely worth looking at. And I would advise anybody, you can normally, to be fair, have a word with adult social care, have a word with perhaps ourselves, have a word with a care home about whether they've got experience of this and whether they think that somebody, even if they pass the checklist, would pass the assessment, because otherwise you might be wasting your time. But for the potential benefits, it's certainly worth looking at. And again, all of these things. Just on the attendance allowance, just one thing briefly I should mention. Again, I think I mentioned earlier about carers allowance. If you're caring for mum and dad, and they're in receipt of attendance allowance, for example, you might be able to claim carers allowance depending on your earnings, and how much care you provide. You might be able to claim that. So that's a thing that's overlooked. And generally, I don't think it can be backdated, maybe 3 months. So again, you want to be looking at that. The important thing with all of these things, apart from carers allowance, is that attendance allowance, the NHS funded nursing care and the NHS continuing healthcare, they are not means tested. So even if I'm Sir Paul McCartney in his 80s, billionaire, and my health then declines, I can claim all of these things subject to my medical conditions or medical situation. The £1 billion and the songwriting royalties do not affect these benefits. So even if you think you've got too much to claim, it's probably not the case in this, because they're generally, I say, they're not means tested. Conclusion: financial cost is important, but I think it's more than about simply pounds and pence and the financial matters. I think it's more about dignity and control, than the money or even your children's inheritance. This is the point. People think, okay, I'll give the house away, I'll give away all the money, and then it's the local authority's problem. Even if that works, and it doesn't always by any stretch, then that means the local authority is dictating the level of care you receive. And also you're left with the figure that you're left with, which is personal expense allowance. So even if you say, oh, giving a house away, so when people say somebody lives in a council house, so they don't have to pay care, they still effectively lose all of their pension income, and effectively they retain an amount of £30.15 per week. Personal expense allowance, I think it's a technical term. And I've witnessed this firsthand. I've done a lot of work with care homes. I've been into a care home once, and I've seen a care worker, and she was rolling up some cigarettes, not for herself, she was rolling for one of the residents. And the reason she said, oh, I have to roll them up because John smokes, pros and cons of smoking. Some people would obviously anti it, which is fair enough. But the point was that he only had £30.15 a week total to spend on himself outside the food and stuff that the care home provide. And therefore he couldn't smoke normally because he just literally couldn't afford it. And of course he couldn't roll up his own cigarettes because he didn't have the physical capability. So you were having to roll them up for him. And this is it. You're effectively rationed on pocket money in your 60s, 70s, when it should be cared for and protected. I think you lose a lot of your dignity. So you have to be cautious on all of this, and what we're generally trying to do is help on the financial side, but also more importantly the dignity and control. As I say, acting sooner rather than later is almost always best. And how we can help you understand your overall financial planning picture, which isn't limited to care. Calculate how much you need now, and also obviously care needs. Work conjunction with other accountants, solicitors and experts to pull together everything so everything's working for you and there's no kind of missing gaps, I suppose, and navigating what is an increasing complex financial world. Help you enjoy your wealth and hopefully not worry about care fees too much. Mentioned earlier, there's a free book which explains our financial planning approach. That's on second. If you just email martin@readytoearn.com with your home address or office address, and we can stick one in the post if you'd like one. Questions from Martin?
Hello again, everybody. And Scott, thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour about care fees. It's a big subject. There's a lot to know about it. Quite a lot of what Scott was telling us this evening were things that don't work, unfortunately. And that's because the things that do work frankly, it's difficult, but as Scott emphasises more than once, planning early is the key, really, and not sort of putting your head in the sand. Before I go on to the questions, I just wanted to reiterate that we are here to help answer any of your questions. If you or someone you know would like to speak about these or anything about financial planning, get in touch. You can come in, sit down at our table here, have a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and we could chat about your financial planning. So please use us as that resource. So questions then. We've got a few questions this evening. First one, Tony would like to know, what would be the effect on deliberate deprivation of taking out an equity release mortgage before you go into long-term care and investing the sum of money in a trust scheme to obtain a greater income? There's quite a lot going on there. Scott, what about equity release and deliberate deprivation?
I think you'd be fine. With all these things, it's always grey. But if there was a clear need to do it from an inheritance tax angle, then firstly you're going to say, well, okay, I've got money at this point. So in today's terms, you as an individual, you're probably going to be worth £500,000 as a couple of £1 million. So the first argument is, well, as a minimum. So the first argument would be is, well, I don't envisage having to fall back on local authority support in the first place because of the assets. How a discounted gift scheme works, for those that don't know, is essentially, yes, you're giving money away, but you're retaining effectively an income, albeit regular capital withdrawals, technically not income, into your bank account. So it's less easy for the local authority to argue that you're deliberately depriving yourself of that money, or certainly all that money. And also, if you did it 10 years ago, all of those factors are going to make it difficult for the local authority to say that this was deliberate deprivation. I think if you knew you were going to go into a care home next month, took an equity release money and just gave it to your daughter, then yes, I think you're going to have an issue. But in this case, I think you're probably fine.
Follow-up question from Tony here is, can the local authority get hold of your personal funds when calculating your assets over and above the 23,250? I think perhaps he means can they get hold of the information about the funds?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. So if it's a question of, well, can I get information? Well, they essentially will go through a financial assessment with you or your representatives, and it's like, well, I suppose all tax and financial matters involving the government. The principle of being open and frank and honest, and you'll be in trouble if you don't disclose information. They will also, you do have to be a bit cautious. I think it was Leicestershire or Leicester Council were a bit sneaky in the sense that one of their guides a few years ago implied that if you needed care, your wife had to complete the financial assessment, which isn't the case. Your wife's money is your wife's money. You have to only really disclose yours. And it was felt by me and some other professionals that there's maybe a fishing expedition in order to find out your affairs. So that's fine. Tony's just clarified, said, I meant to say personal pension funds. Yes and no. So pensions are different when it comes to long-term care and other benefits. They can't make you cash your pension fund in and get the whole pension. However, again, depending on age, so I think if you're younger, you'd be all right, but certainly in your 60s, shall we say, certainly past state pension age, they can insist in essence that you take the benefits from that pension. So not all as one go. So it can make you take the income from that pension fund, and therefore that income could then go to pay for your care fees. It is worth pointing out on that, the situation with husbands and wives or cohabiting couples, civil partnerships and marriage, cohabiting might get a bit messy, so I'll part that for a minute, is if your husband, for sake of argument, goes into a nursing home, but he's got, say, his own private pension, you as the wife staying at home can claim back half of that private pension income towards the help, towards the bills. But if it's the other way around, if the wife in that scenario was to go into a care home and the husband's got the pension, he doesn't have to contribute to her care. So again, you need advice in this situation regarding where people are. Pensions and all of these things there's a lot of nuances and a lot of things you need to know, and a lot of planning, even from splitting joint accounts to single accounts, single name accounts can have benefits.
Thank you, Scott. Gordon asked a question, with something Scott spoke about 10 minutes ago. He says, can you just go over again the splitting of the main residence again? Tenants in common was the phrase. Scott, just break that down again for us, please.
Yeah, so the traditional way that a couple bought a house was they bought it together typically, and it was held in what's called joint tenancy. And what that means is, so you and your husband or wife don't own half and half generally, you just own it together, just our house, isn't it? And the bright side of that, in some ways, is if somebody died and they hadn't made a will, their half of the house, as it were, automatically passed to the survivor. So we owned all the house together. Now the survivor owns it all themselves. And that works really well, and there's lots of advantages to that. However, If that person then goes into a care home, or even worse still, is already in a care home, they suddenly own all of the house, and the local authority will say, oh, great, you've got assets more than 23,250, apart from some exemptions if you've got elderly relatives in there or disabled relatives in there. And right, so that house is now going to be used to pay for your care, because we're not going to pay anymore because you've got a house worth £250,000. What the alternative approach is, you can split the tenancy of the house into what's called tenants in common, and that is an imaginary line down the middle of the house. It doesn't have to be 50-50, but it normally is. So now the husband owns 50% and the wife owns 50%. So they still own 100% of the house, but they don't own it together in that sense as 50-50. The husband and the wife can then go and write new wills, and they say, right, I don't want to leave my 50% to my spouse. I want to leave it to a trust. There's a couple of ways you can do this, but the normal way is you would use what's called an interest in possession trust, and you say, right, I would want my wife to live in the house, and the wife would want the husband to live in the house for the rest of the day, so he can enjoy his half and the deceased person's half for the rest of the days. But the capital value of that house passes to children and grandchildren, and that way it is not the husband's house. Effectively, he's got the equivalent of a lease to live in it in effect, but it's not his house. And therefore, if he then goes into a care home in that scenario, he only owns half the house, his half, not the deceased wife's, and that can preserve half the house. There's some arguments about whether the splitting of tenancy is deliberate deprivation. So again, if you're going to do it sooner, is better. And I haven't seen any cases where the local authority have successfully challenged that, but possibly I've missed one. But again, you're better to do it. I always urge all people to do it. If it doesn't work, you've wasted a few quid on legal fees, but I think more often than not, it should work.
Scott, thank you for that. Another question, Scott, you spoke earlier not only about long-term care, about the importance of wills and also documents to make sure that people can look after your interests when you can't make your own decisions. Just a question by someone who didn't want to give their name today, but they've asked, are your recommended solicitors STEP solicitors? Now, STEP, I should explain to people, is the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, which is a particular part of the legal profession that specialise in those areas. So do we recommend STEP solicitors for wills, Scott, would you say?
That's a good question. But certainly the person that was dealing with it was STEP qualified. They have just left. I'm not sure. I haven't checked on the replacement, so that would be a good point to check. Again, we would have to, you can use your own solicitor. We're not obviously, overly concerned on the exact person, provided they're doing a good job for you. Obviously, we would, if it was one of our clients or we were liaising, we would obviously give a financial advisor's second opinion. We're not solicitors, quite clearly, but we understand the broad principles of what people should be looking at. So I think a combination of the client, a good independent financial advisor looking after you, and a good solicitor, preferably STEP qualified, writing the will, I think should ensure that everything is done in the right order. But I think it's that joined up financial planning that's key.
Thank you, Scott. A question here from Robert. I'm glad to see Robert asking questions tonight. He is a long-term friend of Rowley Turton and a colleague of ours. He's asked, does the will trust, where you leave 50% of the house is gifted to a trust rather than an individual on the first death, does that work for IHT purposes? I think that's very similar to what you were saying a moment ago about the house being split in half. Scott, just expand on that a little briefly.
Okay, so firstly, splitting the house in half itself doesn't necessarily change the IHT treatment of these things. I think where you would need to exercise care is the inheritance tax rules changed a number of years ago to create what's called a residential nil rate band, whereby if your house is left to direct descendants, generally children and grandchildren, then it is up to £175,000 per person, so £350,000 per couple, is exempt. That's part of this £1 million per couple figure I mentioned earlier, so it's important not to double count it. That could be lost if it was left via the wrong type of trust. So if it was left to a discretionary trust, then it isn't left directly to children, then you might lose, well, you probably would lose that residential no rate band. So that could be dangerous. Now, if your assets are less than 650,000, that isn't necessarily an issue, but if they are more, it is a factor. But if it's left to this interest in possession type trust, because the right to reside or the right to enjoy the house is essentially to your spouse, but the capital value is passing to children and or grandchildren generally that would be fine. Again, you would have to be careful that the will and the will trust was set up correctly to ensure that you did take that into account. But again, a good solicitor should be more than capable of ensuring that it's the right side. And there are things that we would go through with you, and obviously we'd expect a solicitor to check as well.
Thank you, Scott. A couple more questions. We've got time for a couple more, I think. One of our, John asks, if my mum is in a home, if my mum goes into the home, my dad still lives in the house, how can they take the house into account for mum while dad's still living in it? What is the position there, Scott?
Well, I mentioned, I think at the start, that whilst this 23,250 figure for assets is generally the starting point, and the house is generally included in that figure, if you have a spouse or civil partner in the house, remaining in the house, so husband's gone, so dad's going to go and mum's still at home, then generally the house is exempt. If you have a disabled relative living in the house, so perhaps there's the son of the person needing care is in home, or if there's a older relative, so somebody generally 60 plus living in house. So the typical thing is two spinster sisters, whereby one owns the house, goes into care home, and then without this provision, the sister would be made homeless. Then the house is generally exempted. So in most situations, with most couples, where only one person goes into a care home, the house is generally excluded. So that's generally not an issue. Of course, it becomes a factor if both parents go into the care home, into a care home, or if the person who is left in the house dies. So even if you felt, I don't need to do this severance of tenancy because mum is still at home and she's still fit and dad's in a care home, so the house is fully protected anyway. If mum was to predecease dad, and it's a kind of sod's law that we always think it's the person with the poorer health that goes first. Odds always that they tend to be the person that goes second, and the person who's perhaps running around and caring for them, more often than not goes first, and that then could be problematic. So again, people need to think about these things and be proactive.
Thank you, Scott. Question here, referring back to something you explained earlier on, Scott, which is the problem about deliberate deprivation and giving things away. You explained that if you give assets, I suppose a house or other things away to children, then the local authority can sort of count it back into the calculation because you've deliberately deprived yourself. Sheila here says she's concerned. She says, you said there's no 7-year rule. Does that mean I simply can't ever gift anything to my children?
No, not at all. It's primarily down to intent, and to some extent timescale comes into this. So the best case of this, where somebody did it ridiculously short timescale and it wasn't counted, was there was a gentleman, it wasn't one of my clients, but a case I read about, where he was literally sent home from hospital to effectively die. He was at end of life, but part of that, he couldn't be cared at home, and his son still lived at home. So he was sent into a nursing home, or went into a nursing home, and at the same time, he gifted the house to his son. Now, his argument is, I wanted to provide for my son. He actually recovered, is probably not the right word, but he was actually in the care home for a longer period than people would have expected, I think several years, and then died. And his only real asset was the house. So there was an argument about, well, okay, surely the house is deliberate deprivation. He's literally given it away as he's gone into a care home. So you can't get any more deliberate than that. But it was down to intent. And the argument was, well, hang on, he had been sent to a care home to effectively die. He was expected to live a matter of weeks. He had some savings which would have covered that cost. The house would have been disregarded for 12 weeks anyway. There's a 12-week disregard, which we can chat to people about separately. And therefore, if he didn't expect to have to pay for care, or certainly beyond his savings, how could he have gifted a house in order to avoid care fees? So in that case, fine. Equally, if I won the Euro Millions, which fingers crossed, and was to give away, all of my money then, or so say 50 million out of my 100 million, well, the other 50 million I've got, I'm not expecting to pay for care. If I then subsequently blew it all on, I don't know, unwise investments or something like that, then again, the local authority might argue, but I'd argue, I did it for inheritance tax planning. Weren't planning to pay for it. So it's not the timing as much, but basically it's down to the timing. Fundamentally.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. You can see it's in glorious Technicolor now because the slide has gone off the screen. I'm not quite sure why. Sorry about that. Said, my dad has lost capacity. He can't make decisions for himself anymore. How does that affect what happens with regard to care fees and making decisions about care fees?
Oh God, that's goes back to the point I made earlier about just turn the questions off mine. Basically down to it's difficult if you don't have a power of attorney in place, a lasting power of attorney in place, generally financial and medical, then it can be difficult for families to make decisions. I urge people to do this sooner rather than later, because in practice, certainly how the care systems tend to work, it tends to work on a common sense approach where mum has gone into care, there isn't a lasting power of attorney in place in most cases, and that, well, what do we do? And the so the care providers typically will listen to, say, the daughter or the husband's instructions for care, because otherwise the system would fall down. That works fine in theory until there's any conflict between you as the family member and the care provider. And this is where you read stories of people kidnapping mum or grandma from their care home. Fundamentally, that has happened because there is not a lasting power of attorney in place primarily for the medical things. And then there's been a conflict between the care home or the medical professionals about the care that mum or grandma should receive. The daughter or granddaughter has obviously, disagreed with those decisions, but legally has no right. And people, if you think about it logically, if you're married or older, and I don't know, your wife or your daughter rang your doctors and said, "Oh, John's gone in for some tests, and can I tell me his results?" So we go, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Miggins, so we can't do that. He has to come in himself and get the results because of data protection." Now, of course, when we start getting old and lose capacity, then that doesn't tend to be typically what happens. But that's not what should happen. That is what should happen. They should say, "No, we can't provide it." So if you haven't got a lasting power of attorney, people tend to get away with it until things go wrong or there's disagreements. But also in terms of financial matters, that is much harder because the banks definitely do not take that view. So if you don't have a lasting power of attorney, so in sake of argument, you wish to downsize, so you're in the middle of selling your house and you want to buy the bungalow. If you suddenly lose capacity during that point, or it's a joint owned property and one of you loses capacity, then the solicitor, will turn around and say, "Well, sorry, you haven't got capacity, or your partner hasn't got capacity. You can't sell the old house or buy the new house." So that is dangerous. Whereas if you have a lasting power of attorney, you can say, "Hang on a second, I have this piece of paper. I've got John's basically pre-appointed me. Let me just sign attorney." Probably have to ring the kids to get them to pick it up from the drawer at home, and it solves your problem. There are ways and means around that, but that generally means applying to the courts and getting appointed as what's called a deputy. There's a delay for that. It's more expensive, and again, goes back to that acting sooner and the financial emotional burden that I mentioned earlier. You're always better to be acting sooner rather than later in these things.
Thank you very much, Scott. Those powers of attorney, the documents that enable those decisions to be made by other people, by children typically, as Scott's saying, they're very important, and they can be drafted by solicitors or sometimes by other people, and people can also do that themselves. But it's something that we emphasise to clients always to have on hand, especially as they get into their later years. I think that's it for the questions for the moment, but I just want to reiterate that if you've got any more questions or anything pops into your head later on, please get in contact. You've got our email addresses already from the emails we sent you to link today, but we'll also be sending you a copy of the slides and a video of today's webinar for you to look back on if you'd like to. So in the meantime, thank you very much for tuning in to this webinar. There'll be another one in a couple of months' time, I expect, on a different subject that we hope you find interesting. This is an ongoing series of webinars, and we hope you'll tune in again. Thank you very much.